Welcome to a special lecture entitled Weapons of Mass Destruction, Terrorism, Global Security by Dr. Hans Blix. First of all, may I call upon the President of Chulalongkorn University, Professor Dr. Kunjing Suchada Kiranan, to give a welcome speech.
Honorable Dr. Hans Blix, Chairman of International Peace Foundation, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen. It is my pleasure to welcome you all today on behalf of Chulalongkorn University to the lecture series, Bridges, Dialogues Toward a Culture of Peace. This lecture series was launched with the pressing awareness of the crucial notion of peace for nations, communities and individuals that can be achieved not through war, but through dialogue and communication among people from all walks of life and academics of various disciplines. Through these lectures, we endeavor to incorporate more meaningful and penetrating discussion into our lives, not only to promote human security, but also to create a climate and culture of peace and understanding. With our attempt to create a climate and culture of peace, it is very fitting for Chulalongkorn University to welcome an eminent speaker, Dr. Hans Blix, who will shed light on peace and disarmament prospects after Iraq. Today we relish the unique opportunity to meet with a personage who is well versed with international law, foreign affairs, atomic energy, and weapons of mass destruction. A person who will give us his first-hand account of the frustrations, tensions, and drama of the months culminating in the 2003 war in Iraq. His talk is pertinent to our mutual aim to create sustainable peace in the world, as his assessment will bring to us not only insight into the current state of affairs in Iraq, but also creative proposal for preventing the spread and use of weapons of mass destruction in the future. We from multidisciplinary backgrounds welcome this opportunity to be inspired by his expertise. In conclusion, I would like to express my sincere appreciation to the International Peace Foundation for its collaboration and support in realizing this event series. May I also express my heartfelt thankfulness to our prominent speaker for traveling halfway around the world and for sharing with us his views and invaluable experience. Thank you very much.
At this time, may I invite Mr. Uwe Morawetz, Chairman of the Board, the International Peace Foundation, to give us a remark.
As a contribution to the Decade for a Culture of Peace and Nonviolence, initiated by the United Nations General Assembly, Thailand has been chosen as the host country for the event series Bridges, Dialogues Towards a Culture of Peace, initiated by the International Peace Foundation, a non-political, independent foundation under the common patronage of the 21 Nobel Peace Prize laureates based in Vienna. Thailand has been chosen for the following reasons. The Thai nation and its people, with their self-confidence, open-mindedness and tolerance, could provide a creative pathway towards peace. Under the wisdom and spiritual leadership of His Majesty the King, as the shining example for inner and outer peace, a democratic Thailand has the ability to promote peace and the potential to stabilize the region. It has a rich, diversified network of national and international organizations, including business, diplomatic corps, media and NGOs, which provide the ground for an enhanced intercultural dialogue. Bridges, Dialogues Towards a Culture of Peace, will be continued today with the keynote speech of Dr. Hans Blix. The series of 250 lectures and dialogues, seminars, workshops, and artistic performances, which started in November 2003, will then be further continued in Bangkok, Chiang Mai, Chiang Rai, Chonburi, Kanchanaburi, Khon Kaen, and Nakhon Ratchasima till April 2005. During a one-year period, 27 Nobel laureates for peace, physics, chemistry, medicine, literature, and economics, as well as decision-makers in international politics, economy, science, culture, and the media, are joining hands with Thai leaders in all parts of society to promote the kingdom as a center for dialogue and international understanding. ผมรู้สึกซาบซึ้งที่คนไทยสนับสนุนและร่วมมือทำให้โครงการสานสัมพันธ์สู่สันติวัฒนธรรมได้เกิดขึ้นจริงๆซึ่งโครงการนี้ได้รับแรงบันดาลใจจากการได้เห็นพระบาทสมเด็จพระเจ้าอยู่หัวทรงงานหนักเพื่อสันติภาพและความมั่งคั่งของประสบนิกรรวมทั้งรักษาวัฒนธรรมขนบประเพณีอันงดงามและจันนงไว้ซึ่งศาสนาในโอกาสนี้ผมขอขอบคุณดร. Hans Blix บาทกาและศิลปินทุกท่านที่ได้เดินทางมาร่วมและสนับสนุนกิจกรรมโดยไม่รับค่าตอบแทนใดๆและผมขอขอบคุณผู้ให้การสนับสนุนและพันธมิตรที่ได้ให้ความร่วมมืออย่างดียิ่งบัดนี้ผมขอต้อนรับผู้มีเกียรติทุกท่านเข้าสู่สันติวัฒนธรรมโดยการสานเสวนาความเข้าใจและความเคารพซึ่งกันและกันร่วมกันในงานครั้งนี้และต่อไปขอบคุณครับ
In a short moment, Dr. Blix will share with us his valuable insights and first-hand experience in weapons of mass destruction, terrorism, and global security. But before that, please allow me to give you a really brief introduction to our speaker, Dr. Hans Blix. Dr. Hans Blix, at the present, is the chairman of the International Weapons of Mass Destruction Commission, or WMDC. However, he was famously known internationally as the former executive chairman of the United Nations Monitoring, Verification, and Inspection Commission during the Iraqi War. He wrote many books in international and constitutional laws. Last year, in 2004, his book named Disarming Iraq was published worldwide in 1,000 languages. And now, it is time we have been waiting for. Distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Dr. Hans Blix.
If I wasn't quite sure what Mr. Uwe was saying at the end, I will now assume it that I was invited to take the floor. Kunying Sukhada and professors and students, it's a great pleasure for me to come for the second time in my life to Chulalongkorn University and to speak to audiences here. I like very much to come to universities because I think they are the home of critical thinking, and we need more critical thinking in the work on foreign affairs in the world. Not least did I experience that in the case of Iraq. I also think that we need more dialogue between universities in the world, and that the discussion is lively about how we shall develop the United Nations, and our relations is lively in Europe and in the United States. That is a discussion that must be spread all over the world, and that countries in Asia, which is booming, that they, not least they, need to participate and develop this dialogue. So I think the Bridges is doing an important job in promoting this dialogue, and I'm glad to participate in it. You will be aware, I think, of a report that was commissioned by Secretary General Kofi Annan, and which your former Thai Prime Minister Anand headed, and which has come out and in little volume recently called A More Secure World, Our Shared Responsibility, and it's a report about the threats, challenges and change, which I recommend and which should be analyzed by the academic communities and the international affairs communities. In this report, they argue that in a more secure world, the global security must mean more than the security of states against armed attacks, which was the traditional meaning of security. It must mean also the security of people against oppression and civil war, hunger, global disease, and environmental disasters. I agree with this view, and I agree that the United Nations has a role to be a mechanism for cooperation to help to provide such broad security. And it's easy to find examples. After the tsunami catastrophe, better warning systems are now discussed regionally and globally. And we also discuss how the strong global will to help can be more effectively coordinated. One conclusion emerging is that the United Nations and its various organizations, which the world community has created as their common instruments, are best placed to bring about global cooperation with the recipient countries, better preparation and coordination of international help. To take another example, terrorism raises grave questions about the security, and we find that many types of global cooperative action to prevent terrorism are best worked out through the UN. Now, which are the greatest threats against security in the world? It has been asserted that weapons of mass destruction falling into the hands of rogue states or terrorists are the greatest threats facing us. Being a chairman of an international commission on weapons of mass destruction and hoping to present a report early next year, I, for one, certainly recognize the relevance of these threats and the acute need to counter them. However, we also need to keep our feet on the ground. For most people in the world, the priority security issues are hunger and poverty, disease and civil strife. And personally, I confess I'm as concerned about the long-term global environmental threats to man's security, notably global warming, as I am about the short and medium-term threats posed by weapons of mass destruction, whether in the hands of rogues or state governments. Nevertheless, the weapons of mass destruction are the problems I shall focus on today, and they are substantial. And let me first put them in a historical perspective for a short moment. Gas, poisonous gas, was used in the First World War, and nuclear bombs were used in the Second. For the long term, I'm optimistic that there will be no world wars, and that the still vast arsenals of nuclear weapons will not be used. Why? When we look back into history, we can see that the quests for territory, the demands for territory, have been one of the main causes of war, grabbing territory. We can also see that ideological and religious aims have been behind many other armed campaigns. I think these two main causes of armed conflicts between states are disappearing. Whether we want it or not, the gradual global integration that is being brought about by the technical, economic, and information revolutions are gluing us together. The increased interdependence and proximity will push relations between blocs and continents towards peace. I admit there is some uncertainty. We can see today some unease between the United States, long dominant in Asia, and China as the fast-rising economic giant of the region, with India 2 steps behind. And the Taiwan issue is certainly not without some danger. Now, it has taken the world's countries long to get to today's high level of interdependence. The UN Charter of 1945 sought to provide a system for collective security. In cases of any threats to the peace or breaches of the peace, the Security Council was authorized by the Charter to intervene, if need be, with military force, to stop aggression and to restore peace. In the practical political world, it was unable to do so. During the many years of the Cold War, the communist camp tried to expand territorially in the name of ideology, and any collective security actions of the UN could be prevented by a Soviet veto. The West developed at that time a policy of containment, and states had to find their security through the right of individual or collective self-defense, through alliances like NATO or neutrality, not through a collective security system of the UN. We should note, however, that even during the Cold War, some agreements were made in the fields of arms control and disarmament. The Partial Test Ban Treaty prevented nuclear testing in the atmosphere and reduced the radioactive fallout. The Non-Proliferation Treaty provided a dual bargain under which non-nuclear weapon states committed themselves to remain without these weapons, and the nuclear weapon states committed themselves to negotiate towards disarmament. So it was a pact to do away with nuclear weapons. One commitment was to put into operation immediately. The other one was long-term and depending upon negotiations. Biological weapons were not believed to be useful even during the Cold War, and a convention prohibited production and possession of these weapons. Many bilateral arms controls agreements were made between the United States and USSR. The second strike capability, which both the US and the USSR retained, led to what was called MAD, or Mutually Assured Destruction. The ability of each of these powers to strike back even if it had been hit gave it a mutual deterrent. It gave them very good reasons not to attack each other. After the end of the Cold War, around 1990, and the collapse of communism, the threats had reduced in most parts of the world, and the security against military attacks has increased very much. There is continued détente between all the big powers, and there are no significant territorial or ideological conflicts between them, providing incentives for military action. In Europe today, the role of the military forces is no longer seen to be territorial defense, but rather to be prepared for the use in peacekeeping or peace enforcement. In the field of arms control and disarmament, the global détente brought several welcome results. Above all, the conclusion of the Convention prohibiting for all states the production and possession of chemical weapons. Secondly, the signing of the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty, and the expectation that an agreement would be reached to stop all production of highly enriched uranium and plutonium for more weapons, the so-called Cut-Off Treaty. All these three conventions, draft conventions, were reached during the détente in the first half of the 1990s. The most important joint United Nations action made possible by the climate of détente and cooperation was, of course, the authorization given to the broad alliance created by President Bush the Elder to intervene in 1991 to stop Iraq's naked aggression and occupation of Kuwait. Through the UN-authorized intervention in Iraq, we discovered what détente, cooperation, and the notion of collective security could be, as intended by the Charter. However, through the IAEA inspectors who went into Iraq after the ceasefire, the world also discovered that Iraq, a state which was a party to the Non-Proliferation Treaty and had thus committed itself not to acquire nuclear weapons, had in fact an advanced program for the enrichment of uranium and for the production of nuclear weapons. So while the collective security system functioned and the Security Council authorized the alliance, the actual occupation and inspection in Iraq after the Gulf War discovered that Iraq had not respected its obligation under the Non-Proliferation Treaty. Later, UNSCOM inspectors brought evidence also of a significant program for biological weapons and even of the testing of biological weapons, although Iraq never used them against Iran in the 1980s. These discoveries could not but shake the confidence in the reliability of the Non-Proliferation Treaty and the safeguards verification system, which was meant to deter and detect any cheating. When in the same period already the earliest IAEA inspectors in North Korea concluded that North Korea had not declared all the plutonium it had produced, the question was inevitably asked whether the NPT, the Non-Proliferation Treaty, was like a big Swiss cheese full of holes. Was the world being lulled into a false sense of security by the treaty regimes and by insufficient verification? What further unpleasant surprises might there be, it was asked. And work started to bring about a drastic strengthening of the IAEA safeguards inspections. And these efforts led, I'm happy to say, in 1997 to the adoption of a new protocols for much more effective inspection. I'm glad to say it because that was the last year I was myself Director General of the IAEA, and I was able to leave the organization with adopted protocols for a much tougher inspection system. Nevertheless, these events seem to have weakened the United States' dedication to and reliance on global arms control agreements, and given rise to ideas about a policy of more active unilateral counter-proliferation. The concept was not and is not terribly well defined, but it certainly comprised options of special armed operations to stop the development of nuclear weapons capabilities. And the Israeli bombing raid destroying the Iraqi Osirak nuclear reactor in 1981 is the example that comes to mind of such attacks. The many years during which Saddam Hussein was able to play cat and mouse with UN inspectors presumably further eroded US confidence that international economic sanctions and inspection would bring credible assurance about the absence of any weapons of mass destruction in Iraq. Before 9/11/2001, neither the US nor any other members of the Security Council actually suspected that there was any Iraqi nuclear threat in the foreseeable future. This was before 9/11. Although there were suspicions that Saddam retained some biological and chemical weapons and missiles, Saddam was, it was said at the time, he was kept in his box. Even so, the US, as the rapidly growing military superpower, to the US, Saddam must have appeared as an intolerable defiance to the US superpower. The temptation for the US to go then from containing him in his box to replacing him was there. Regime change was desired, but there was no clear reason for war, no casus belli. We now know, I put the question, how did the non-existent weapons of mass destruction become the casus belli, the reason for the attack? We now know that in all likelihood Iraq destroyed most weapons of mass destruction in the summer of 1991. Yet Iraq behaved during the 90s as if it might still possess prohibited weapons. Now, regardless of what might have been the reasons for this conduct in the 1990s, I shan't go into them, in 2002, the US and the rest of the world suspected that the Iraqi conduct was linked to the existence of hidden weapons of mass destruction. These suspicions were fed nourishment by Iraqi defectors who wish to see US military intervention, not UN inspection. Their messages, the messages of the defectors and their contrived information were warmly received by groups in Washington which were eager to use arms and to secure a friendly regime in Iraq. The arguments in favor of armed action varied. To some, it was important that stationing of US troops in Iraq would be less problematic than keeping them in Saudi Arabia, and could also be a useful pressure against Iran. Moreover, the oil reserves of Iraq were the second largest in the region and important for future US imports. However, the main reason used and advanced was that of the possession of weapons of mass destruction. While the US armed action against Afghanistan had been justified by the Taliban regime's hosting the authors of the terrorist attacks on 9/11, solid justifications for an armed attack on Iraq were not easily found. The allegations about Iraq's links to terrorists and about the existence of illegal weapons of mass destruction programs never had much substance. However, where the evidence was weak, it was spun into virtual reality, and intelligence organizations gave the war-bent political leaders in the US and the UK what they looked for, if not explicitly asked for. Too often, intelligence abandoned its proper role as coldly seeking, coldly investigating, and coldly analyzing information. Today, they probably regret it. Who will believe them the next time they cry wolf? The period of United Nations and IAEA inspections in Iraq was not welcomed by all in Washington. Vice President Cheney said simply that inspection was worse than useless. And he told Mr. El-Baradei of the IAEA and myself that the US would not hesitate to discredit the inspections in favor of disarmament. You will find detailed descriptions of this in a book that I've written about disarming Iraq. While on the one hand, US authorities were, I would say, helpful to the inspection organizations, the governmental leadership must have found it irritating and inconvenient that independent professional international inspections found no smoking guns. Indeed, it appears, judging by Mr. Woodward's account of the plan of war, that some in the United States leadership had become so convinced of their own arguments about weapons of mass destruction that they believed the inspectors were lying, and they arranged, according to Woodward, to have me bugged my telephone listened to. Well, my reaction would be that I only wish that when they did so, they had listened a little more carefully to what I had to say. The US chose to ignore that UN inspections did not confirm US allegations, and that we even expressed skepticism against some intelligence information, which we were able to check, including some that Secretary of State Colin Powell presented to the Security Council. However, other members of the Security Council, other countries members of the Council, did not ignore what the inspectors had to report. They concluded that inspections worked and should continue. What was the hurry, they said? Tremendous pressure, you may recall, was exerted on these members of the Council to support the US-UK proposed armed action. We should appreciate that these countries stood fast. What would the world have thought of the Security Council today if it had authorized the war in March 2003? For that matter, what would the world have thought of international inspection if we had endorsed the intelligence that claimed the existence of weapons of mass destruction that turned out not to exist? The official legal justification of the war has been that Iraq had violated a number of resolutions of the Security Council, and that action was taken, I quote, to uphold the authority of the Council, unquote. However, it seems strange that individual members of the Council could have the right to uphold an authority that the majority does not want to exercise. If the US, UK and Spain, which was in the Council at the time, had such an authority to intervene, presumably Russia, China, France and Germany, who are also members of the Council, could also have taken action, perhaps different action. It seems evident to me and to many international lawyers that it was for the Council as a whole to decide, and that the Council was in fact ignored. The main political justification, as distinguished from the legal justification of the war, was that Iraq had illegally retained weapons of mass destruction and that these constituted a threat to the US and the UK and the world. However, the closer we got to the day when the armed action was unleashed, the weaker and less credible the evidence looked. A contract between Iraq and the state of Niger in Africa for the import of uranium oxide, which was mentioned by President Bush in his State of the Union message, was shown to have been a forgery, a fake. Just to give one example, if inspections had continued for another few months, we would have been able to inspect all the sites suspected by intelligence organizations. And as there were no weapons, we would have found them empty, and we would have so reported to the Security Council and to those who had given us the tips about the sites. The war might not have been waged. In such a case, Saddam would probably have remained in power. Perhaps he would have become like a Castro, a dictator to his own people, but no great dangers to his neighbors of the world. However, we were not given further months of inspection. The war was unleashed, and the collective security system of the UN was ignored, and a counter-proliferation action was undertaken to identify and eliminate weapons of mass destruction which did not exist. The Iraq Survey Group, which was established by the CIA in the summer of 2003 to look for the weapons, has recently made it known that no weapons can be found, and it makes no further efforts to look for them. It is hard to resist the reflection that the war and the International Iraq Survey Group operation was a very costly way of concluding that there were no weapons of mass destruction. The UN inspections cost some $80 million for a year and involved some 200 to 300 people. The cost of the war was high in terms of dead and wounded and damage of property. It required hundreds of thousands of men and hundreds of billions of dollars. Another reflection is that it should now be natural for the US, which took over the role of inspectors, to report to the Security Council that weapons of mass destruction cannot be found and probably do not exist. If the US said that it took action to uphold the authority of the Security Council, it would seem that it now reported to the Council. Resolution 687, which was adopted in 1991 as a form of ceasefire with Iraq, and which has not been suspended, stated that the elimination of weapons of mass destruction in Iraq constituted the first step towards the establishment of a zone free of weapons of mass destruction in the Middle East. And the need for such a zone without weapons of mass destruction in the Middle East has not diminished. However, that concept of a zone will not be seriously discussed in any period of high tension or conflict, for instance, during an intifada. The current contacts between Israel and Palestine might bring us a climate in which a zone free of weapons of mass destruction, or more generally a zone of security, can be discussed. Admittedly, the further development of the nuclear issue relating to Iran has an important impact. Should there be no arrangement under which Iran voluntarily suspended enrichment activities without time limit, the prospect for progress towards a zone would be negatively affected. A third reflection is the following. It is welcome, I think, by everybody that the elections just held were much more successful than many had feared. An early declaration by the United States that it intends to withdraw all military forces, even without indicating a date, and that it does not have the ambition to seek military bases in Iraq, would strengthen confidence that the establishment of an independent, peaceful and democratic government, and not the establishment of military bases, was the main aim of the war and the occupation. I turn to the impact of the Iraq invasion on the collective security system of the UN. From the viewpoint of the collective security of the system of the UN, the extent to which the United States has claimed that it is free to take armed action is worrisome. Article 51 of the UN Charter recognizes a right of self-defense, I quote, when an armed attack occurs. Right of self-defense is written to the Charter when an armed attack occurs. However, the US has explained that in the time of weapons of mass destruction, long-range missiles, and terrorist groups, it feels at liberty to take armed action in anticipatory self-defense, preemptively, in anticipatory self-defense, not only where it deems that attack to be imminent, but also where it sees a growing threat. What is a growing threat or a growing danger? And would the US recognize that all states in the world have a right to strike against what they consider to be growing threats? Considering the surprise attacks on the United States in 2001, I think all governments would probably maintain that they would see it as their duty to their own population to take action, if need be, even unilateral and armed action, to seek to prevent a terror attack that they learnt was coming, They would not ask for a permission slip from the Security Council. However, there are two crucial problems with the claim of a right to such an anticipatory self-defense. And the first is that before an attack actually has taken place, the knowledge about it is likely to depend upon intelligence. And the Iraq affair does not give us much confidence about national intelligence as a reliable basis. Where it turns out that the basis is erroneous, then what is meant to be an anticipatory self-defense may become a totally unjustified attack. The second consideration is that although imminence may be a severe time requirement, a growing threat would be an extremely lax criterion to allow self-defense. It has been suggested that an effort should be made to reformulate Article 51 of the Charter to give some room, more room for preemptive action. And the high-level panel that has recently reported to Kofi Annan rejects the suggestion. It warns that any widening of the right to self-defense will be open to abuse by all states. I agree with this view of the panel, and I find it more likely that an answer to the question when unilaterally decided self-defense is acceptable to the world community will slowly emerge through precedents. In each case, the position of the Security Council will prove important. It will also be important, as Kofi Annan has noted, that the Security Council actively consider and monitor any threats posed by possible weapons of mass destruction, giving all the members of the Council the feeling that the issue is taken seriously and that there will be a readiness on the part of the Council to take joint action where there is convincing evidence of a threat that is significant and near in time. Such evidence did not exist in March 2003 for Iraq. After the Iraq controversy, we may wonder if the new United States security agenda continues to consider the Security Council as irrelevant when it does not support the US. Will the US continue to de-emphasize reliance on and cooperation through formal treaty alliances and instruments and agreements, including the UN? It is too early to know. It is difficult to understand, however, the disdain, not to say the contempt, which the US has shown the United Nations. I do not see myself why the US could not loyally proceed in conformity with common multilateral regimes, including the UN, and only retain the factual power which it has to go it alone when it perceives an extreme interest to do so. So, where are we going next? I shall first discuss the weapons of mass destruction threats linked to terrorist groups, and thereafter the threats from weapons of mass destruction in the hands of governments. The first point to make regarding the terrorist groups, I think, is that terrorists do not live on the clouds, but must have their feet on the territory of states. It is important that the international community upholds the principle that each government is obliged to ensure that its territory is not used as a base for attacks on other states. It is legally correct and practically and politically sound. If there is a failure in this duty, then the world will endorse forcible intervention, as it did against the Taliban government in Afghanistan. Secondly, broad international efforts must continue to ensure the safekeeping of nuclear and other dangerous material and equipment everywhere in the world to reduce the availability of such material and equipment. If the Pakistan government had exercised better control over its nuclear sector, Mr. Khan's shop for nuclear weapons designs and centrifuges would not have been in its dangerous business. A resolution by the Security Council urges more cooperation between states and more action by states to prevent proliferation, a spread of weapons of mass destruction. And a new interesting feature in the UN is that it demands of states not only to take specific action on the ground, but also demands of states to adopt legislation prohibiting non-state actors from acquiring or producing weapons of mass destruction. Thirdly, what is mostly needed immediately is intensified international cooperation in the day-to-day field work of the national intelligence, police and financial institutions of states to trace persons, resources, weapons and dangerous material. Now, the manner in which the world fights terrorism is also important, the manner in which they do it. To be sure, the motives of terrorists vary, and many of them will be rather muddled. However, if reasonable non-armed measures can be taken which reduce incentives to terrorism, they should be on the agenda. Brutal or illegal response measures are likely to breed further terrorism and attract civilian support for extreme movements. Now I turn to the question of states and weapons of mass destruction. Even though there is some concern that terrorist groups might get hold of and employ nuclear weapons, and the concern is much more acute regarding nuclear weapons in the hands of states, the attempted violations by the NPT parties, North Korea, Iraq and Libya, come to mind, and also the suspected but denied violation by Iran, which is also a party to the Non-Proliferation Treaty. How should the world community tackle these questions? It is Iran and North Korea that today makes us hold our breath, and that raise a host of difficult questions and fears of domino effects should either acquire nuclear weapons. Both countries, both Iran and North Korea, have acted in disregard of their safeguards obligations on verification. The DPRK, which has renounced the Non-Proliferation Treaty, has claimed that it is ready to deter foreign attacks by developing nuclear weapons capability. But it has also declared that it is ready to scrap that capacity if some conditions are fulfilled, including guarantees about security from attack, what they suggest a non-aggression pact with the United States. Iran has declared that its intention is only to use its legal right under the NPT to enrich uranium in order to make fuel for its own power reactors. It has also signaled that while it cannot accept to be deprived of this right of enrichment, it might consider voluntarily suspending some activities, including enrichment, if the quid pro quo, if the carrots, as it were sufficient. In both cases, a number of states are at the present time seeking solutions through negotiations, and this is welcome. The war that was waged in Iraq is not a model that many would like to see followed in Iran or in North Korea. In my view, solutions for the DPRK and Iran must aim at ensuring that both states renounce all nuclear activities through which bomb-grade material, whether enriched uranium or plutonium, could be produced, and that they accept comprehensive verification. The minimum in that regard would be full acceptance of the additional safeguards agreements of the IAEA. Now, to induce them to make such commitments will require some attractive quid pro quo. As regards the DPRK, I submit it might be wise to make the economic part of the package attractive to North Korea by constructing it in such a way that will help the country to gradually exit from the system, the economic system, which has brought it to misery and starvation. China here probably should be the model. The economic part of a longer-term agreement with Iran will need to cover trade and investment relations, perhaps support of World Trade Organization membership. And if Iran is to forego the investment it has made in an infrastructure for an indigenous production of enriched uranium for use in power reactors, a multilateral assurance of supply of uranium fuel at market prices must be given and seems indeed to be on the table. It is my belief that both in the case of Iran and the case of North Korea, some guarantees may need to be given about security against attacks from the outside, negative security guarantees. The diplomatic game is still on, which is better than seeing it off. Newspaper speculations about the bombing of Iranian installations and about Iranian retaliation are added features in this psychological game. Let us hope that all sides feel the seriousness of the situation. Let me come to some concluding remarks. I confess I see dangers on the road traveled in the last few years by the US administration. Further exploration of new types of American nuclear weapons will not, I think, induce others to disarm and to renounce weapons options that are technically open to them. There may be more weapons and conflicts rather than less on this road. A further development of the shield against incoming missiles might well set off countermeasures by China and Russia. By contrast, a resumption of the kind of leadership that the US used to exercise in the arms control and disarmament field would, I think, be greeted with enthusiasm by the whole world and could lead all away from weapons of mass destruction and towards greater security. The United States used to be a lead wolf, not a lone wolf. I shall suggest some actions that I think could lead out of the current stalemate in the disarmament sphere. First, much attention should be devoted to solving the political and security problems that almost invariably underlie the development or acquisition of weapons of mass destruction. This is true for Iran and the DPRK. The trouble about finding political solutions is that it often takes time, and you have to do something before you get to such solutions. US ratification of the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty would be likely to have a positive domino effect, including China, India, Pakistan, Iran, Iraq and Israel. It will make the development of new types of nuclear weapons more difficult. Continued non-ratification of a comprehensive test ban might have very high costs. The conclusion, thirdly, of a verified cutoff of the production of highly enriched uranium and plutonium for weapons purposes, combined with agreements on reductions in the number of weapons, would gradually reduce the deadly arsenals. There would be no more material to put in new bombs, and as the US and Russia and others go along with reducing the number of bombs, we can thereby reduce the arsenals in the world. Thirdly, a greater reliance on independent and professional international inspection with broad rights to access on the ground and with some intelligence supplied by national authorities would give governments and governing boards and the Security Council unbiased assessments. UNMOVIC, which I headed, might be given further functions by the Security Council in the Council's proposed stronger engagement to counter weapons of mass destruction. For instance, as a subsidiary and advisory board of the Council it could perform challenge inspections in the fields of biological weapons and missiles, where there are no inspection mechanisms at the present time. It's only the IAEA that performs inspections in the nuclear field and the OPCW, which is performing inspections in the chemical field. For missiles and for biological weapons, there are no inspection organs. And I'm glad to acknowledge that in the work of the UNMOVIC, which I headed, we also had some Thai inspectors. While UNSCOM earlier had a very strong concentration of inspectors from the Western world, we made it an important point to be representative of the world and turn to all the world's countries, and we had a positive response from Thailand and had Thai inspectors, including one who is here today. I'm glad to see. Now, lastly, as someone who has been responsible for the operation of verification and inspection, I might conclude by saying that in foreign affairs, as in medicine, you cannot have successful operations unless you make a correct diagnosis. You need to apply critical thinking, with which we are familiar at the universities, in order to get correct diagnosis. If you do not, but instead create your own virtual reality, that reality may collide with the reality that exists on the ground. And this, in my view, is what happened in Iraq. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Blix. We are grateful for what you have shared with all of us today, especially here in Thailand, with the sensitive issue that affects us all around the world. Thank you very much, Dr. Blix. This is such a rare opportunity to hear from an able and well-respected man with invaluable insights and first-hand knowledge. Nonetheless, we hope to learn more through the next session, when you will have a chance to ask Dr. Hans Blix questions. Our moderator is Dr. Panithan Wattanayakon from the Faculty of Political Science. As a reminder, our staff will be collecting the questions from the audience. หลังจากที่ท่านได้รับฟังปาฐกถาจากดร. Hans Blix โอกาสนี้นะครับจะเป็นโอกาสที่ดีที่ท่านจะได้ถามคำถามดร. Hans Blix โดยเจ้าหน้าที่ของเราจะเก็บคำถามจากท่านนะครับมาให้กับดร. ปณิธานวัฒนายากรจากคณะรัฐศาสตร์จุฬาลงกรณ์มหาวิทยาลัยซึ่งจะเป็นผู้ดำเนินรายการของเราต่อไปนะครับ I would like to turn the floor now to our moderator, Dr. ปณิธาน